My name is Clay Williams, and this is People Talks, presented by Canal Pursuit Productions. The idea behind People Talks is that everyone has a story and everyone's story has value. People Talks is a mixture of people with lived experience and people working in the fitness and mental health fields. This week's guest is Mark Smith. Mark oscillates from devoted student at the Center for Training in Psychotherapy to a passionate and loving designer at his small architectural design firm that specializes in residential home design, drafting, and permit wrangling, to playfully exploring life with his partner, Gillian. He believes his life work to be an ongoing study of how to better help others and himself achieve goals as well as relieve suffering. Mark's personal mental health came into focus as an area of passionate study while experiencing directly the role of being a primary caregiver to his ailing father, dying from Alzheimer's about 7 years ago, while his mother was also recovering from a near-fatal car accident. Through his childhood and his experience as an elite level athlete, Mark has experienced many extremes of connection and disconnection between mind and body and is continually playfully exploring. Welcome to People Talks, Mark.
Thanks. Excited to be here, Clay.
We met at an online team meeting for a project we're involved with a few other people, and maybe we'll mention something about that a little bit later. Well, we did an around the room quick introduction of all of us, and Mark mentioned his study in psychotherapy, and I had to make sure I collared him and got him onto People Talks for a talk. So I'll ask you a really open question. What has led you to studying psychotherapy?
Yeah, it's actually hard to believe that I can pinpoint the exact moment. I mean, I guess it was more the moment at which I kind of started getting really curious and need of help for looking at psychotherapy as a tool to help me while I was with my father. It was actually the day that he was finally accepted into a long-term care facility. And I had been supporting him for probably 2 years on weekends. My parents lived about 3.5 hours away from Toronto, so I would drive every weekend, kind of make their meals and just try and make life a bit easier. And once he finally got into the care facility, there was this really strange moment where the greeter kind of came in and was super pleasant, and he kind of smiled at her, and we kind of had like a little smile, and then she left, and he kind of looked at her once the door was shut, and then looked at me, and he mouthed these words of like, leave, or like angrily get away. It was so strange because like there was this abruptness to seeing the split within my father that like instantly turned on in me like a light bulb. And the challenge is that I knew he was declining, and that like he was an architect and a very intelligent person. So I knew that there was part of his brain that was kind of lessening this split, so that like it was more apparent that there was these two different people that kind of interact in different ways. And what made me so uncomfortable in that moment is I had a deep realization that what was in him was most likely in me. And the only difference was that I had enough faculties to keep rationalizing it away. So I couldn't actually see what was going on. And it kind of made me realize that evening that if I wanted to do something different or be different, then I really needed help. And at that time, it started to become much more difficult with Alzheimer's, in the sense that my father died numerous times. And it's this strange thing where the loss is only really experienced by the caregiver. It's not really experienced by them, because they're always in the present moment and just kind of getting younger and younger and younger.
Wow. So you started seeing a therapist around that time, right?
Yeah. So I actually took it as a very like type A personality way and interviewed 3 different people. And it's so funny now after having like been in the study, because when I initially did the interviews, I remember the first 2 people were very, very keen on dreams. And like at that time, I didn't have any. And I also didn't think there was much to dreams. So I was like kind of insulted. Where I was like, like with the first therapist, like, hey, lady, like I got real problems. I don't want to break down my dreams. Like I just told you for an hour, like real stuff that's bothering me.
Yeah.
But it was beautiful because the third therapist was actually a psychotherapist that had a specialization in like relational psychotherapy. And it was nice because after our initial meeting, he kind of reflected back and noted that he could really see that there was a lot of feelings I couldn't really touch, but there was clearly a desire to start to feel them. So he could kind of notice that there was a bit of disassociation, and we've kind of worked together ever since.
During the last couple of days, I've been editing a video of a previous interview from last week with a psychotherapist, a practicing psychotherapist who also has a major in philosophy. And one of the things he said that I remember really clearly is, if you see a therapist, give it 2 visits before you decide if you click with that person or not. And if you don't, then change therapist. It's okay if you don't feel that connection, because there really has to be an openness and a vulnerability and a trust, right? And the right person. It has to be the right person for you and for your situation. So yeah, interviewing. I totally get that. That type A personality interviewing the therapist. Did you have a rubric where you compared strengths and weaknesses?
I mean, interestingly enough, I think that it was rather rudimentary, which was like, did I feel heard in the hour that I kind of shared my problems and what I thought was like going on? Obviously, like as you kind of dive deeper into therapy, there's like layers, and under the surface layer, you start to learn that the actions might be compensating for other things, or trying to defend or protect you in a way. But
yeah, I guess at that early stage, it's how you feel at the end of it, which is not such an empirical thing, right?
Yeah, and I think it's actually important, like what you said, as far as like the other therapist. I think that it's extremely important to find a fit. And you're going to be working on yourself, and someone is going to be bringing up like your blind spots. We all have blind spots, and by definition, only others can help us find them. So it's naturally a very vulnerable place,
right?
And that intuitive sense of safety when you initially meet someone does, I think, have an important criteria, like an important component as far as selection and proceeding.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that makes sense. So you're studying. How long have you been studying? When are you going to be finished? What's going on?
So what's interesting is this school is set up as a part-time school, so it's concurrent with your profession, and it basically runs evenings and weekends and intensives. And it can take anywhere between 4 to, I think some students take 8 to 10 years. I think my own therapist went through the program over about 8 to 10 years. And the idea is that it's a slow simmer, that you don't accidentally become a therapist. You don't kind of, go into an undergrad and come out and instantly start helping people. There's all sorts of different stages where you have to reapply, and there's a 4-year requirement of group therapy, which is a huge component of the school. As well as your own personal therapy that has to run concurrently with the school, and you have to have done at least 80 sessions of personal therapy before you can even apply. It's part of the criteria. So the idea is that in the psychotherapeutic means in which they're training, you can't offer something that you haven't first received benefit from. And I think that that's truly an important thing to kind of hold as a value in its schooling.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I'm
for
in
sure.
my second year. There's 2 years, basically a foundation phase where you canvas the entire chronology of like the rudiments of therapy back in the late 1800s or earlier,
Hmm.
all the way to some modern day psychotherapy, as well as neurobiology and the
Hmm.
crossovers and things like that.
Interesting, interesting for sure. So it's not it's not as simple as a trade. It's definitely a calling by the sounds
No,
of the amount of work that's involved, right? And I don't mean that like in a really simple term. It's something that takes more than just showing up to the school and putting in the hours and studying and finishing your exam.
right. I think that that's so important, right? Because like I remember there's one book and he breaks it down really well. I've heard it phrased other ways, but like Atul Gawande wrote a really cool book called Checklist Manifesto, and he breaks down like all problems in the world to three categories.
Mm-hmm.
There's like a simple problem, and that's like baking a cake or something like that, like follow a recipe, guaranteed result, consistent, repeatable. And then he says, like, the next level of problem is complicated. That has to do with launching a rocket ship, which is like 10,000 cake recipes
Mm-hmm.
interacting with each other, but still repeatable,
Mm-hmm.
has some sort of means to follow. And then the last level of problem is complex, and
Mm-hmm.
that's raising a children or helping somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Because the problem is that there is no static variable. The person you're helping is changing at the same time that you're changing.
Mm-hmm.
So both variables are constantly moving. So it's the most complex problem you could ever try and tackle to
Yeah.
help another or to raise a child, as I'm sure you've experienced.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting viewpoint. Thanks for that. The understanding that you're changing as the person that you're helping is changing as well, right?
Mm.
That's kind of cool. What I can see how that keeps you interested and going back, right? Um, so one of the things we talk about in People Talks is the mind-body connection, and you kind of did a quick description in your bio about being connected and disconnected. Um, and what is, again, a really nebulous question. What does that look like for you? The times that you have felt really connected and the times that there was a disconnect.
I mean, that kind of starts way back. So when I was
Mm,
a young child, I was actually very obese.
mm,
Um, so I was amazing at fast food and video games, but those didn't really offer much for the physical response.
mm,
So I think that that's where there was quite a disconnection that began within my body. And then um, in my early teens, I was introduced to rock climbing, and that actually created an environment that really created a fun challenge where the side element was fitness, but you were actually just like focusing on like a three-dimensional real-time video game,
mm.
as far as like how to get to that pink rock and how to get
Right.
from it.
The
um,
boss level up at the top, right?
yeah, yeah, very much so. It kind of it appeals with a lot of very primary emotional components of our body. Like if you think about
Mm,
it, like even when we're using ropes, it triggers fear response and all these
mm,
different deeply innated parts of our body.
mm,
And it's really helpful because it forces an agency. Like no matter what someone tells you how to do something on rock climbing, like you have to use your own strength to get to the top. And
mm,
normally it's your own way. It's a very creative sport. So that
mm.
like helped started creating a connection with my body, and I became very flexible and took rock climbing very far with 4 days
Mm.
a week and intensive pursuits for over 20 years.
Wow.
And then I kind of pulled back a bit from that with my father and Alzheimer's, because the challenge I realized was that climbing is very much like drinking espresso, in the sense that it's a very intense. I mean, I could even correlate it to trail running versus
Mhm.
like running on a road. I find that because there's more things stimulating you from the world. And I found this exceptionally difficult to kind of parse when my father was declining, because, here I was climbing over this lake with eagles flying by me on extremely small holds on this brilliant colored rock and 200 feet above the ground. And somehow I also wanted to just enjoy walking and perhaps like falling asleep on the grass with my father,
Mhm.
because that was the limits of what he could do.
Mhm.
And therefore I kind of tried to withdraw. And I think similar to, doing any kind of espresso withdrawal, there was a bit of a recalibration to sensitivity, just because it's very different to be in the world when you're constantly either trail running or rock climbing or doing
Mhm.
these things that are very intense, and then you just kind of do things like walking or laying on grass.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's one of these things where I guess I really wanted to understand how to become a better listener. And I guess this also has a therapy element later, but it started with like a listening to my body, where it was like I either need a high input outside as far as like relative danger,
Mhm.
or I kind of need to work on myself, which is like the amplifier, which is like if
Mhm.
I just listen better, then laying on the grass could be this fantastic thing with my father. So
Mhm.
it
Mhm.
really kind of changed this idea of how I was using my body in the world to kind of experience emotions or relationships.
Mhm.
And then through his disease and primary caregiving, and then through therapy, I've learned that you don't have to hang off the edge of a cliff to feel all of the feelings
Yeah.
at quite high intensities too.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's interesting. I think a lot of people understand a lot of runners who have had an injury and have had to stop running for a couple of weeks or 6 weeks or something like that understand that change from that daily or every second day intensity to calm waters for a long time, and definitely miss that. There's a withdrawal, as you mentioned, right? Um, not everyone understands how to um, how to replace that or how to deal with that vacuum or that temporary vacuum, right?
Well, it's hard because I think similar to running, a lot of activities are very community based. And when they're active communities, like the buy-in is that you have to be active. So in
Mm-hmm.
injury, you unfortunately, and I've experienced this as well, like there's somewhat of an exile. It's not intentional, but it's just that activity is what brings people together or keeps that flowing.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore you do kind of get stuck in these really hard places
Mm-hmm.
uh, when trying to work through an injury.
Yeah, 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 for sure. Interesting, kind of a related thing. I've I've been a high energy kind of guy for quite a while now. I remember probably I was in my 30s, and um, people were talking about stress. Don't get too stressed. Mental health was just starting to come into the media, and stress is terrible for you. And I thought, I live on stress. Stress keeps me alive. If I don't have something that's tempting me or threatening me or pushing me or motivating me, I don't know what I do. So I've always tried to bite off a little bit more than I can chew, so that I'm a little bit afraid of failures, and that motivates me to do. And when the pandemic started, I thought, with all the things that I was already doing, so working on canal pursuit projects, and we had bought a house 3 years prior, and I was doing all the little renovation things to make the house better, and work, and some extracurricular work activities, and running, and all the things. And then the pandemic hits, and wow, here's an opportunity. Someone's going to get rich out of this. Someone's going to, people are going to get hurt, but people are going to find an opportunity out of this somehow. There's going to be some way to come out on top of this. I'm quite a clever guy, and I'll figure it out. And I didn't, and I haven't yet. So it was really frustrating to me to be shut in for a little while. I spent some time at home early on, and not doing very much, not socializing, not doing the things that I had been doing. And I think a lot of people in similar situations, but just seeing this unpredictability that was ahead, I think has caused a ton of stress for people. And just I think a big component of that is lack of control. If you don't know what tomorrow looks like, you can't prepare yourself for it, right? You can't plan for it. And I definitely saw that in my own life, right? Just because I was sure that with this situation, it's a terrible situation, but there's got to be some opportunity somehow, right? There's got to be some way to do some good. So anyway, that's kind of a long way around to saying I didn't come out of the pandemic with a new business idea that's going to set me up for retirement, but I have people talks. So anyway, with all of that said, you do some trail running, right? Mm-hmm. And do you still are you still a rock climber?
I'd actually say I'm more a runner these days.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've actually been experimenting a bunch with different aspects of running. So during, or I guess just when COVID started, I was really into minimalist running, and I was trying like ultra low tread shoes. Right. I had like a Vivo barefoot shoe.
Okay.
And unfortunately, I got a really horrendous compression fracture.
Oh man.
It was like after 6 months, but I was talking to a sports doctor about it, and the challenge is actually there was a huge conflict from like what I had done to my skeletal structure for rock climbing, mm-hmm. which created a certain kind of loading on my foot that was really hard, and it had a bit of like a roll outwards, and therefore just over time this barefoot running, which felt like it was getting better, just like one day mm-hmm. snapped.
Yeah.
So it's been a learning experience, and kind of healed the foot, got some really good ASIC shoes, and tried again and approached it differently. And it's been actually really fun because I've kind of been cross-pollinating fields. So I've been trying to like implement meditation while running, or implement meditation while doing yoga, and kind of creating an entire routine that includes all of it. Mm-hmm. And there's been some interesting success. And I've actually talked to runners about this. I'm not sure if you've ever experienced this, but have you ever felt like a running orgasm? And it sounds really weird to say. Like, I know there's like a runner's high, like similar, but
yeah, I don't think I've ever. No.
Yeah.
No, not anything that I'd consider something like that. I know that there have been times when it's more, rather than a runner's high, it's like a euphoria. It's usually later on in the run. So when I first start out, the first 2 kilometers is just work, right? Because you're getting your metabolism up to speed, you're getting your heart rate up, your respiration level up, your body's warming up and balancing out with your outside environment and your speed and so on until you on a comfortable run until you reach kind of an equilibrium, unless you're doing tempo runs or something like that. And I do quite a bit of road running, so I can go long stretches without having to think about where my next turn is or jumping over rocks and roots and stuff. So there have been times when I'm on a long run and just everything's working great. There's no pain. I have energy. I feel like I can do this forever. This is awesome. And maybe that's the runner's high. But it's
it sounds a little similar. I mean, this had a little more to do with just different breath work that I was kind of playing with. And
okay.
what's interesting is, like, after a while, I got to a point, especially in the summer, where I could actually cultivate it instantly the second I started running. And it was very odd in the sense that, like, it literally felt like I was naked and had just orgasmed, and it wouldn't stop while I was running. And, like, I guess what was interesting about it is, in a sense of the word, it was like I was thoughtless. And I kind of almost had this, it sounds ridiculous, but I had this mantra, which was, you breathe, I breathe. And, like, especially in the trails and nature, if you think about it, like, a tree is constantly breathing out the air we breathe in.
Right.
And there was something about, like, just constantly working with this, and there was long straightaways where I could even just close my eyes, run, and breathe. And there's something oddly comfortable about running with my eyes closed that just feels like a natural state, as if that's what I'm doing most of the time.
Wow.
But yeah, it was a really interesting thing, and I kind of shared with a couple of runners and tried to hear different feedback from it. But
Yeah, I've run with my eyes closed, and it more often brings panic than comfort to me. There's yeah, there are times when I've been running and it just feels right that I should be closing my eyes right now, but then it doesn't take long before I realize that there could be anything out there trying to kill me, right? I'm not sure. I'm not sure what's in my background that brings that out.
yeah, I mean,
So
it's an important insight, right? To kind of feel that fear. And it's interesting because, like, on long country roads, I used to live up in the Lions Head area, and I would go for a run at like 5 in the morning. It's like proper dark up there, right?
Yeah.
So it's just like you can't see in front of your face with your eyes open.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really matter. And there's just, like, long straightaways. So it was an interesting experiment to kind of play with.
Yeah. 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 So you said you were up in the Lions Head area, or
Yeah.
where, and still is most of your running trails now or roads or?
So I mean, right now I'm kind of back in Toronto full time, so trails are very limited to the beach or some ravines that I've found some loops in. But previously I lived very close to Bruce's Caves up in the Owen Sound / Wyerton area.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I lived there for a couple years and did some running as well as some climbing, and kind of then headed back to the city.
Yeah, yeah. I'll ask you a question before we close off, and I'm not sure you're okay with answering it, and I can edit it out if that's okay. So, considering we're in a pandemic, and people who may have been struggling with anxiety a little bit before are almost certainly struggling a little bit more with it now. Any advice? any tricks, or not tricks, any tools that you've learned to use in your own mental health journey for yourself that you might be able to share with someone?
Yeah, actually, it's so funny because I guess I'm 37 now, and I think I'd say for 33 years of my life, I would never identify as an anxious person, didn't know what anxiety was, and was pretty
Mm,
sure I wasn't that. And I would say that there was this gift I had while I was also kind of deep diving in research and primary caregiving for my father. I stumbled upon a Vipassana meditation course,
mm,
and it's a 10-day silent meditation retreat. And I have to say that that is basically an intimate relationship between you and your anxiety for 10 days. And like they kind
mm,
of feed you, they give you a place to sleep, they take care of your car, you're in the woods somewhere. And the first time I did that was about 4 years ago, and it completely changed my life because it actually made me realize that I've been anxious my whole life and I just
mm,
didn't have words for it and didn't understand it and couldn't separate from it. There's normally like a metaphor, which is we're looking out a window and we're so close to the glass that we don't know that there's glass there,
mm, mm,
right? And that's kind of like anxiety. Anxiety is like that glass where you can step back and realize that there's actually something there and
mm,
it doesn't have to be grabbed onto. So from that experience, it truly helped going into COVID because it's almost like I had practice in isolation. Like I
right.
did self isolation and did this meditation retreat for 10 days prior to COVID, and I've done it many times since. But as far as people struggling, I would highly recommend looking into some forms of meditation. And it's definitely something that like you microdose and it's very hard to tolerate at first,
Mm,
especially myself. Like I was a person that went from having like 2 or 3 quads of coffee a day,
mm.
which is, 4 espresso shots. And now I've done like 1 coffee a day and I've done many like caffeine completely abstinent
Mhm,
30-day um, shots. But the idea is that if you can slowly get more comfortable with doing less,
mhm,
it kind of helps take away a lot of the energy that anxiety feeds off of.
mhm,
Because I think especially in nowadays our culture and our access to information, the fuel for our self-critic
mhm.
to attack us on what we haven't done
Right.
or to like make someone else an imaginary superhuman
Mhm,
is very easy and very powerful as a foe that then kind of kicks the crap out of us. And I mean, I can
yeah.
speak for myself. Like
Mhm,
I was very good at doing that,
mhm,
and it really left me in a constant like not enough place, right? Like type A is
mhm.
normally like the
Right,
active pursuit against that, where it's
right.
like I'll show you not enough. But the
Mhm,
meditation kind of offers a very different way to understand ourselves and
mhm,
really reduces that pressure by understanding that the pressure is kind of self-imposed.
mhm. Yeah, you mentioned kind of starting, it's going to be a foreign and uncomfortable thing initially, and starting in like uh, you said microdose, right?
Yeah.
Um, Something like maybe a mindfulness session for a few minutes, a quiet walk, and just being mindful of, um, yeah, well, mindfulness, right? Of where you are, what you're feeling, what you see, what you hear, just as a little bit of practice and getting to be comfortable with, um, yeah, just yourself and your skin, right?
Yeah, and there's definitely a lot of teachers that I kind of went
Mhm.
to and learned from. There's a really amazing meditation group that meets weekly virtually, Consciousness Explorers Club.
Okay.
They actually experiment with all sorts of different meditation modalities, and they
Hmm.
do a little sit together for 30 minutes, and then they also do a group interactive experience with the modality to learn a bit more. And then, as I said, personally, it's a high buy-in. I understand 10 days to kind of carve out your life, but interestingly enough, is this particular practice kind of apparently comes from the source of how the Buddha himself taught, and there was actually a need to pull you away from society and completely disconnect you for a while because you slowly drop down. And like myself, the first 10 day I didn't actually know I was anxious until day 8, right? Like for 8 days, there was just like constant fear, and I worried about a car that wasn't going anywhere, and food that was given to me, and all these different things came up. So Vipassana is a pretty amazing place to look into, and there's actually there's only 2 or 3 in Canada, and one of them is actually just outside of Barrie, quite close to Toronto. And the course is entirely free. They only accept donations after you've completed if you choose to donate. And then there's a bunch of phone apps too, right? So Sam Harris has got a very good wake up app, which kind of delves into meditation with short little 5-minute doses, and then Headspace as well. So each person is kind of different. I encourage just curiosity with a little trepidation, knowing that it's going to bring you into uncomfortable places. But that's where a lot of growth comes.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's about all I wanted to cover. Is there anything that you wanted to bring up while you were waiting for the call and thinking, you know what, I really want to say this when I'm talking to Clay?
I guess I was more curious about suicide and the aspects of your brother and how this came about. But when we initially touched base, there was one quick comment that you had said you had lost a brother. I learned earlier that you'd lost 2. And personally, I had actually supported a friend that almost killed themselves, and I talked to them for 2 hours while they were holding a gun. And also my ex-wife, there was a very close call. So I've kind of been intimately involved, and then I also volunteered for the distress center for over a year and a half, kind of supporting suicide calls nonstop. So yeah, I guess I was most curious of just, what that was like for you. And I know that it's me talking.
Yeah, I think I haven't shared this a lot, but I have shared it, so I'm feeling okay talking about it. When my oldest brother took his own life, I remember it really clearly. My father, I was in university residence in Toronto, and my father called. I had to go down the hall. I got paged and had to go down the hall to where the phone was. I'm that old. It was a really brief conversation. Ted passed away. He was in a hotel in Saskatoon where he lived and worked, and they found him in a hotel. He had been taking some painkillers for back pain and accidentally took too many. So it was really clear right from the start that my father's line on it was that it was an accidental death, not a suicide. And he never admitted to anyone in the family for the next 20 years until he passed away, that his son took his own life. There was a suicide note that he read, and then he tore it up. And the story to the rest of the family was that it was an accidental death. But I knew my brother. I didn't know that he had attempted suicide prior. Nobody talked about that kind of stuff, right? I thought he was my hero when I was a kid. He was a big brother that was the smartest one and the wittiest one, and always had the best jokes, right? And when he passed away, I had dreams for probably 20 years on and off, where I would see him on the street in a really crowded, it was always a really busy street, and he was on the other side of the street, lots of people around, and I'd see him, and he would see me, we'd make eye contact, and I'd say, why? Because I knew in my heart, even not being told, that he had taken his own life. And then I found out after 20 years that yes, there was a suicide note. It was all kept secret from us, and all of that. So it was a verification of what I kind of knew intuitively, and somehow that he had taken his own life. My second brother, who died by suicide, was really clear. He had a gun business and was found in his living room with a handgun beside him, and slumped over in the chair, right? So that was really clear, and that was in 2007. But by then, there was way less stigma around that whole subject. So we actually talked about it a little bit as a family. Certainly not like it is now. You actually see if newspaper obituaries use the word suicide, where you would never see that. Even 5 years ago, you would never see that in any kind of public announcement. That would be the thing that was talked about, maybe at the wake afterwards or something. So yeah, I guess we briefly talked, I think, before I pressed the record button. But I think the story of those two suicides wasn't something I talked about at all, or shared, or anything, until I started to let's say become a mental health advocate. So when I started doing what was initially going to be just a fundraiser, I started to understand a little bit more about what is mental health, and what do Canadians do about their poor mental health. And that was coincidentally around the time that there was a lot of media coverage about our police veterans and military veterans struggling with high suicide rates, struggling with PTSD and high suicide rates. So it's like summer of 2014 and 2015. And Robin Williams died by suicide. And I've got a little brother named Robin Williams. He's still with us. But all of that kind of linked together made me think that I should talk about this so that others can talk about it. And then yeah, once that story was out, it became a thing that I could look at a little differently than prior. Right. Yeah. So it's funny that that's not funny. I find it strange that I can talk so easily about it now, but couldn't talk about it for 20 years, right?
It makes sense, right? Like the way that it was initially presented to you was to not talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Right? Like that pager, which does kind of hate you a little bit.
Yeah.
Sounds really, really difficult to kind of hold the feelings and the tone of voice and perhaps the things that didn't make sense that weren't said, and then kind of wait and process that on your own. It sounds really difficult.
Yeah, and I don't think I stewed about it a lot. I don't think I spent a lot of time directly thinking about it, but I know it was something that weighed on me a little bit, and that's clear just by the dreams that I had over years, right? But it's one of those things that's had an effect on me that I guess I probably still haven't fully explored yet. Right. For sure.
Yeah, and I wonder, like, especially in COVID, when we were all like kind of locked down, when you can't move, I imagine that's the hardest place.
Yeah,
because
for
then
sure.
the thoughts get really loud.
Yep. Yeah. I don't have something external to create a little noise and ring a few bells, right?
Did you find any tools for during COVID when you were kind of in that locked position?
Running.
So you ran no matter what.
Yeah, it was always there, even when I even when for a couple of weeks when I couldn't get to work, or there wasn't very much going on. Running would always kind of take the edge off, right? Would kind of smooth things over for a little while, for sure. And yeah, no, I don't think I ever found anything. I'm still frustrated that I haven't found the thing that's going to be really financially successful when everyone gets back to work. If you got something, let me know.
This people talk seems like a really beautiful idea.
It's
Maybe it's less about financial and more relational, which statistics are showing is actually going to add much more meaning and value to your life.
Yeah, it's been really rewarding. I've spoken with athletes and therapists, and a CBT practitioner, a retired police staff sergeant that's running a peer support training program, and I've had some really cool conversations, and a student in the Center for Training in Psychotherapy. But yeah, it's been People Talks has been a lot of fun, for sure. And with that, I think we're gonna call it a day. And I just want to thank you very much for spending the time with me, and the open discussion, and yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me on the show.
All right.